Are you a data scientist? Do your tools make it easy to track your experiments, deploy to a machine learning model to production, and manage a GPU cluster? This free book from O'Reilly can teach you how to do all that. It's about tuning neural nets, making them scale, and then deploying them to the real world.
My presentation today is going to be autobiographical, so sample size of 1, don't take it too seriously. So who am I? I'm a data scientist with Nanotech Galaxy. We do machine learning algorithms to analyze radiological imagery. So we use machine learning to predict diagnosis that would have been done by a radiologist if he was looking at an X-ray, for example. So quite complicated stuff. Now, 6 months ago, I was a project manager for a development company. Now, one might think, how the hell did I get to become a data scientist from a project manager? Now, one caveat is that I'm actually a mathematician, so that helped a bit. But from the time I did my degree, I spent 2 years working in a completely non-technical industry with people who do not know how to format an Excel spreadsheet, let alone compile a machine learning model. So why did I hack? Why did I decide to do it so quickly? Why did I hack my career? Now, I had a bit of a falling out with the academia. When I was back at school, I've always been called the smart but lazy student. I've always done my assignments at the last moment. I've never been, well, I've been some of the teachers' pet, but not all of them, definitely. So when it got to university, it got worse. So I suddenly realized that, wait a minute, I don't actually, I'm not in love with what I'm doing. I'm not particularly excited about half of the subjects. I'm falling asleep at 10 a.m. even if I had 10 hours of sleep the night before. So even though I'm a big fan of maths and a big fan of science, I decided not to do a PhD when I graduated. I realized that I wasn't going to survive it. And as I'm seeing from a lot of my friends doing their PhDs, they're just barely surviving it themselves. So I decided to become a data scientist about a year ago when I watched a TED talk by Jeremy Howard, the CEO of Analytic, who are actually now our main competitors at the moment. And I was really inspired. I finally realized that my long-standing interest in the sciences and in neuroscience as well could be made into a career, which is AI research, machine learning. But how do I actually do that? When I started researching into degrees, I realized that, well, it's going to take me 1 year for a master's and 3 years for a PhD if I get the funding or if I get accepted. I quit my job November last year. If I were to go for a master's degree, it would have cost me £28,000 as a non-EU student, and I would have started in November this year. Not now even. So I would have still been in my job, which I hated, not knowing what my future is, suffering from uncertainty and facing a large bill from the university as well as the living expenses. So I decided not to do it. I quit my job and I saved some money and I just devoted 6 months to learning, to teaching myself to become a data scientist as quickly as possible. Why would this even work as an approach? Now, because everybody knows that we've got these universities, everybody wants to go and do a degree because that's what people normally do. Well, from practice, one might suspect that, in fact, a lot of social systems are hackable. You don't generally have to follow the rules. If you actually become a bit scientific and a bit of a statistician, you can take calculated risks and calculated inconveniences that other people decided not to take or were too afraid to take and actually find a much faster route. Now, why does our society support higher education in general? The standard answer to that is because, well, there's social pressure, because you're expected to do a degree. But that wasn't the case 100 years ago. Nobody graduated from school like in the 19th century. What you had was people transitioning through labor, people transitioning through family connections, or pure talent and being noticed. Why do we now do our degrees? Well, one might say that, well, we need a more structured approach. We need to actually, and this is valid, we need primary education, we need children to be guided into their careers to, and have some standardized base from which to build upwards. But an economist called Robin Hanson also has another idea specifically about university and higher education. It's not about social pressure, it's about social signaling. It's about prestige. It's like wearing a Prada bag or Louboutin heels for girls. So what you're actually doing is by having a degree, you're telling the employers that, well, you've been good enough to get into this university. You've been, it's like a label that is easy to validate and is easily noticeable. So this is why the new equilibrium is that generally people go into higher education now. We don't just try to transition into doing things straight after school or even after primary school as would have been done even 50 years ago. But the cost of that is increasing. So if you look at the cost of education in the States, between 1980s and 2014, it has skyrocketed. The average student is now facing an insurmountable debt if their family obviously isn't rich enough to pay for them. So this situation looks a bit like the tulip trade in Amsterdam. So the market got so much out of control. We've got a bubble here, quite obviously. And because we've got a bubble, clearly it's not a very good idea to buy into that. There must be another way. You're not in an absolute need of something. But let's say, what if in fact education gives you some value? What if it's not just about social signaling? Well, there is some evidence against that. There was two researchers called Schmidt and Hunter did a meta-analysis of the best predictors of success of an employee after interviews as per employer. Now, the best predictors are obviously work sample tests. How well have you seen them do their job? IQ, because the higher the IQ, the faster a person would generally learn. Employment interviews, but just the structured ones. The unstructured ones are far way down the list. So if you have a standardized approach, if you asked everybody the same questions, you can weed out the people who are worse and pick out the people who are better. Job experience, number 14. The fact that you have 10 years of work experience doesn't say much about how good you're going to be at your job, even in your existing industry. And number 16, we've got years of education. It explains 10% of the variance in job performance. So really, if you have spent 5 years after university on PhDs and postdocs, it really doesn't say much about you in real terms. So even if you might get an easier time finding a job, you're not going to get an easier time keeping a job. And moreover, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to find a good job or a job that you're going to enjoy. This is something that's going to be controlled by other factors like how intelligent you are, how persistent you are, how much have you practiced, 10,000 hours. Has anybody read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers? There you go. So it's not about intelligence alone, it's not about practice alone, but the two together make a winning recipe, and they do not depend on where you went to uni. Obviously, the two are correlated, so if you've got persistence and intelligence, you would have gotten into a better uni, but maybe you just lucked out. Or maybe you gamed the school's educational system, which is very different from actual industry, and that allowed you to get good grades and get into a good university. But writing an essay a week to a predefined set of criteria isn't the same as putting software into production at a 2 weeks notice and you don't even know what it's going to be yet. So really, betting on education isn't a very good idea in general, assuming you know what you're doing though. Ouch. So what did it mean for me? First of all, as I've already said, I didn't want to pay 28K on tuition fees alone. These are the real figures, by the way. This is how much Masters in Machine Learning and Statistics costs at UCL, and also a similar degree at Imperial. They all cost about £28,000, and they are also few and far between. If you want to go for a boot camp, there is one, i.e. private education, which is more practically oriented. There are a few, but as far as I'm aware, there's only one decent course in London, and they take 20 people at a time.